Alright, let's talk about one of the most radical intellectual revolutions in human history, and I'm willing to bet most of you have no idea just how radical it actually was. You've heard of Hippocrates, right? Father of medicine. Maybe you know about the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors still swear some version of it today. But here's what nobody tells you. This guy didn't just invent some medical techniques. He fundamentally transformed how human beings understand reality itself. Think about this for a second. For thousands of years, literally thousands, when someone got sick, the explanation was simple. The gods are angry. You offended Zeus. A demon possessed you. Your neighbor cursed you. That was medicine. That was healthcare. Prayer, sacrifice, magic spells. And then this one guy on a small Greek island says, What if none of that is true? What if disease is just natural? Now, I want you to understand what's at stake here. This isn't just about medicine. This is about the birth of scientific thinking itself. This is about the moment when human beings decided that the world operates according to discoverable principles, not the whims of supernatural beings. Hippocrates is doing philosophy. Deep, radical philosophy. He's asking, what is the nature of reality? How do we know what's true? What's the relationship between mind and body? What do we owe each other as human beings? And he's doing all this around 460 BC, which means he's figuring out germ theory and medical ethics, while most of the world is still trying to decide which chicken to sacrifice to make grandma's fever go away. So over the next hour or so, we're going to explore not just what Hippocrates believed, but why it mattered then and why, here's the thing, it still matters now. Because the questions he asked, we're still asking them. The tensions he identified, we're still wrestling with them. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's set the scene. We need to understand what Hippocrates was up against, what the world looked like before his revolution. Picture ancient Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, really any ancient civilization. Someone in your family gets sick, high fever, can't keep food down, getting weaker by the day. What's your move? You don't call a doctor, not in the way we understand that term. You call a priest, or a shaman, or a magician. Because illness isn't a medical problem. It's a spiritual problem. As you can see here on the slide, ancient medicine was completely intertwined with religion and superstition. And I want to emphasize, this wasn't ignorance or stupidity. This was a coherent worldview. It made perfect sense within their understanding of how reality worked. Think about it from their perspective. The world is full of invisible forces, gods, spirits, demons. These forces have power over your life. They can help you or hurt you. And the boundary between the physical and spiritual? That doesn't really exist. It's all one reality. So when disease strikes, the question isn't, what biological process is happening in my body? The question is, which god did I offend? Who cursed me? What spiritual imbalance needs to be corrected? The slide mentions that illness was understood as divine punishment or supernatural curses from displeased gods. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't just a primitive belief. This was a sophisticated theological and philosophical system. The ancient world had elaborate theories about how the spiritual realm interacted with the physical. They had complex rituals carefully developed over centuries. They had practitioners who spent their entire lives mastering these arts. The Asclepieian temples, we'll talk more about these in a moment, weren't just religious sites. They were healing centers with their own methodologies, their own understanding of how healing worked. People would sleep in these temples hoping for healing dreams sent by Asclepius, the god of medicine. Now, before we get too smug about how much smarter we are, remember these people built the Parthenon. They invented democracy. They created philosophy, mathematics, drama, architecture. They weren't stupid. They were working with the best explanatory framework available to them. When you don't have microscopes, when you can't see bacteria or viruses, when you don't understand biochemistry, the supernatural explanation actually makes a lot of sense. But here's the crucial thing, and this is where the philosophy gets really interesting. This worldview had profound implications for how you understood human agency, moral responsibility, and the nature of knowledge itself. If disease comes from the gods, then healing requires divine intervention, which means the healer's job isn't to understand nature, it's to mediate between humans and the divine. Knowledge isn't discovered through observation and reason. It's revealed through religious experience. As the slide indicates, those who treated the sick were priests, magicians, or faith-based practitioners, rather than empirical physicians. And that word, empirical, is key. Because what's missing is the idea that you can learn about disease by carefully observing it, by studying patterns, by testing hypotheses. So when Hippocrates comes along and says, no, actually, disease has natural causes that we can study and understand, he's not just proposing a new medical theory. He's proposing a completely different epistemology, a different way of knowing what's true. He's saying, we don't need to wait for divine revelation. We can figure this out ourselves. Through observation, through reason, through careful study of nature. And that right there, is one of the most important moments in human intellectual history. Because once you accept that premise, once you say, natural phenomena have natural explanations that we can discover, you've just opened the door to science, all of science. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's meet the man who started this revolution. Next, we'll look at Hippocrates himself, who he was, where he came from, and how he developed these revolutionary ideas. Because understanding the man helps us understand the philosophy. So who is this guy? Who's the person audacious enough to look at thousands of years of tradition and say, yeah, we've been doing this all wrong? Hippocrates is born around 460 BC on the island of Kos. And I want you to picture this place. It's not Athens. It's not some major power center. It's a relatively small Greek island in the Aegean Sea. Sunny, beautiful, but not exactly the intellectual capital of the ancient world. And here's what's fascinating. As the slide tells us, he receives his medical training in the Asclepian temple right there on Kos. Wait, hold on. The Asclepian? Isn't that one of those religious healing centers we just talked about? The ones with the divine medicine and the healing dreams? Yes. The guy who's going to revolutionize medicine by separating it from religion learns medicine in a religious temple. You can't make this stuff up. But here's what we need to understand. The Asclepion wasn't just a temple. It was also a center of learning. These places accumulated knowledge. They kept records of treatments and outcomes. They had libraries. They were, in their own way, conducting a kind of proto-empirical medicine, even if they interpreted everything through a religious framework. So Hippocrates is getting the best medical education available. He's learning anatomy, limited but real. He's learning about herbs and their effects. He's observing patients. He's seeing what works and what doesn't. But then, and this is crucial, the slide tells us he was heavily influenced by pre-Socratic philosophy. This is where everything changes. Who are the pre-Socratics? These are the first Greek philosophers, people like Thales, Heraclitus, Democritus. And what are they doing? They're asking radical questions about the nature of reality. Thales says, everything is water, which sounds weird until you realize what he's really saying. Natural phenomena have natural explanations. We can find fundamental principles that explain the world. Heraclitus says, everything flows, nothing stands still. He's discovering the principle of change, of natural process. Democritus is theorizing about atoms, invisible particles that make up everything. Do you see what's happening? These philosophers are creating a new way of thinking about reality. They're saying, look for natural causes, observe patterns, use reason to understand the world. And Hippocrates, this is his genius, takes this philosophical revolution and applies it to medicine. He integrates rational inquiry and natural observation into medical practice, as the slide says. He's not just a doctor, he's a philosopher-physician. He's asking, if the pre-Socratics are right that natural phenomena have natural causes, then disease must have natural causes too. Not divine punishment, not demonic possession, natural causes. This is what the slide means when it says he revolutionized the field. He didn't just discover some new treatments, he changed the entire conceptual framework of medicine. And that's why 2,500 years later, we still call him the father of medicine. Not because he was the first person to ever treat disease, obviously not, but because he established medicine as a distinct scientific discipline. What does that mean? A distinct scientific discipline. It means medicine becomes its own field of study with its own methods, its own standards of evidence, its own body of knowledge that builds over time. It's not a subset of theology anymore. It's not magic, it's a science, or at least it's on the path to becoming one. Now, don't get me wrong, Hippocratic medicine is still pretty rough by modern standards. They don't know about germs. They don't have antibiotics. Their anatomy is limited because they don't do many dissections. But the method, the approach, That's what matters. Observe carefully. Record what you see. Look for patterns. Test your ideas against reality. Build knowledge systematically. So we've got this revolutionary figure. But what exactly is his revolution? What does he actually believe about disease and health? That's what we need to explore next. All right, here's the slide that captures the essence of the entire Hippocratic revolution. Hippocrates fundamentally transformed humanity's understanding of illness, shifting from supernatural explanations to natural observable causes. Let me tell you why this sentence is more philosophically radical than it might first appear. When you say disease has natural causes, you're making several huge philosophical claims all at once. First, you're claiming that nature operates according to regular, discoverable principles. Not chaos, not divine whim, principles. Second, you're claiming that human reason is capable of understanding these principles. We're not helpless. We're not dependent on divine revelation. We can figure this out. Third, and this is subtle but crucial, you're claiming that the boundary between the natural and supernatural is real and meaningful, that we can distinguish between them. Do you understand what a big deal this is? In the ancient world, most people didn't make a sharp distinction between natural and supernatural. The gods were part of nature. Nature was full of divine forces. Hippocrates is drawing a line. He's saying, there's a natural world that operates by natural laws, and that's what we need to study if we want to understand disease. Now, he's not necessarily denying the existence of gods. This is ancient Greece, after all. But he's saying, whatever the gods are doing, disease isn't it. Disease is natural. This has profound implications for human agency and moral responsibility. Think about it. If disease is divine punishment, then the sick person might be morally guilty. They did something to deserve this. And the cure requires moral and spiritual reformation. But if disease is natural, if it's just bad air, bad water, poor diet, environmental factors, then the sick person isn't guilty of anything. They're just sick. And the cure requires understanding nature, not appeasing gods. This is actually liberating. You're not at the mercy of angry deities. You're not cursed. You're not being punished for sins you might not even know you committed. You're sick because of natural causes, which means you can potentially do something about it through natural means. Instead of, let's sacrifice a goat and hope Zeus forgives you, it's, let's change your diet, get you some exercise, and see if that helps. One of these approaches has a slightly better success rate, as it turns out. Now, I want to be careful here. The shift from supernatural to natural explanations isn't complete or simple. Even in the Hippocratic writings, you'll find references to the divine. The transition is gradual. And here's something really interesting. Philosophically speaking, this raises a question we're still dealing with today. What counts as a natural explanation versus a supernatural one? Where exactly is that boundary? We think we've settled this, but have we? When people today talk about holistic healing or mind-body connection or spiritual wellness, are those natural or supernatural claims? How do we tell the difference? What Hippocrates gives us, and this is his lasting contribution, is a method for answering these questions. You observe, you test, you look for patterns, you see what works. If prayer makes people feel better, okay, but does it work better than medicine? Can we measure the difference? Can we observe the mechanism? This is the birth of empirical thinking in medicine. The idea that we should base our beliefs about disease on observation and evidence, not on tradition or authority or divine revelation. And notice, this is exactly what the pre-Socratic philosophers were doing in other domains. They were looking for natural explanations for natural phenomena. Why does it rain? Not, Zeus is crying, but water evaporates, forms clouds, falls back down. Why do we get sick? Not the gods are angry, but something in our environment or our body is out of balance. The philosophical framework is the same. Nature is intelligible. Reason can understand it. Observation can reveal its patterns. But here's what makes Hippocrates special. The pre-Socratics were theorizing about cosmology, about the fundamental nature of reality. That's abstract, that's distant from everyday life. Hippocrates brings this same rational, empirical approach to the human body, to suffering, to life and death. to the most intimate, immediate concerns that every human being faces. He makes philosophy practical. And you know what? When your philosophy has to actually cure people, when it's literally a matter of life and death, you find out pretty quickly if your ideas work or not. You can theorize about the nature of the cosmos all day long, and nobody can really prove you wrong. But if your medical theory doesn't help sick people get better, that's a problem. So Hippocrates is developing what we might call an epistemology of medicine, a theory of how we know what we know about disease and health. And his answer is, we know through careful observation of nature, through studying the body, through recording what treatments work and which don't, through building a systematic body of knowledge over time. Now you might be thinking, okay, great, natural causes, but what are those natural causes? What does Hippocrates actually think is happening when we get sick? Excellent question. That's exactly where we're going next, because Hippocrates doesn't just say disease is natural. He develops a specific theory about what health and disease actually are, and that theory, the theory of the four humors, is going to dominate Western medicine for the next 2,000 years. Let's see why. All right, now we get to the heart of Hippocratic medicine, literally and figuratively. The theory of the four humors. And I know what you're thinking. Oh great, ancient pseudoscience. This is going to be ridiculous. But hold on. Before we dismiss this, I want you to understand something crucial. This theory is brilliant for its time. It's wrong, we know that now, but it's brilliantly wrong. It's systematically, philosophically, elegantly wrong. And honestly, understanding why smart people believed wrong things is often more educational than just learning the right answers. Because guess what? We believe wrong things too. We just don't know which ones yet. So here's the basic idea, as you can see on the slide. The human body contains four fundamental fluids: humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is the perfect balance of these four humors. Disease is imbalance. Treatment aims to restore harmony. Simple, right? But here's where it gets philosophically interesting. Look at the correspondences here. Each humor is associated with an element, air, water, fire, earth, a season, spring, winter, summer, autumn, a temperament, sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic. This isn't random. This is a complete cosmological system. Hippocrates is connecting the human body to the structure of the entire universe. Remember those pre-Socratic philosophers we talked about? Many of them believed that everything in the universe is made of four elements: earth, air, fire, water. This goes back to Empedocles. So what Hippocrates is doing is taking that cosmic theory and applying it to human physiology. He's saying humans aren't separate from nature, we're part of nature. The same principles that govern the cosmos govern our bodies. This is actually a profound philosophical move. It's a form of what we'd call naturalism. The idea that humans are natural beings, subject to natural laws, made of the same stuff as everything else. Not special creations. Not separate from the physical world. Part of it. And notice the emphasis on balance. The slide says, health represented perfect balance amongst humors, disease indicated imbalance. This is a deeply Greek idea, the concept of harmony, of the golden mean, of equilibrium. It shows up everywhere in Greek philosophy. Aristotle's ethics are all about finding the mean between extremes. Plato talks about justice as harmony in the soul. What makes this theory so appealing is its explanatory power. It can account for everything. Why do people have different personalities, different balances of humors? You've got more blood, you're sanguine, optimistic, social. More black bile, melancholic, thoughtful, maybe depressed. Why do diseases vary by season? Because the seasons affect the balance of humors. Winter is wet and cold. That's phlegm season. Summer is hot and dry. Watch out for yellow bile. Why do different treatments work for different people? Because people have different humoral constitutions. The only tiny little problem with this beautiful, elegant, comprehensive theory is that none of it is true. There's no such thing as black bile. The four elements aren't actually elements. And your personality isn't determined by having too much phlegm. But here's what I want you to understand. The theory being wrong doesn't mean the approach was wrong. Look at what Hippocrates is doing methodologically. He's observing patterns in disease. He's trying to find underlying principles. He's creating a systematic framework. He's making predictions that can be tested. He's connecting individual cases to general laws. This is science. It's early science, it's wrong science, but it's the scientific method in action. And the slide mentions something crucial: treatments, including diet, exercise, and herbal remedies, aimed to restore bodily harmony. Think about this. Instead of magical incantations, Hippocrates is prescribing dietary changes, physical exercise, herbal medicine, environmental modifications. Some of these actually work, not because they balance the humors, that's not real, but because diet matters, exercise matters, some herbs have genuine medicinal properties. So Hippocrates is getting real results, but for the wrong theoretical reasons, which is fascinating philosophically. This raises a deep question in philosophy of science. Can a false theory still be useful? Can you have the right practice based on wrong theory? The answer apparently is yes. Hippocratic medicine worked well enough to dominate Western medicine for 2,000 years, not because the theory was right, but because the practices, observation, systematic treatment, attention to lifestyle were sound, which means doctors were successfully treating patients for 2 millennia while being completely wrong about how the human body works. Makes you wonder what we're wrong about now, doesn't it? But here's what's really important about Hippocratic medicine, and this is where we're going next. It's not just about the theory of humors, it's about seeing the patient as a whole person. Okay, this slide, this is where Hippocrates really shows his philosophical sophistication, because he doesn't just think about disease in isolation. He thinks about the person who's sick. Look at what the slide says. Health understood as the harmonious balance of physical body, mental state, and environmental context. Body, mind, environment. All three, together, inseparable. This is radical. This is still radical today. Let me break this down. When you go to most modern doctors, and I'm not criticizing them, they're working within their system. What happens? They look at your symptoms. They might run some tests. They diagnose a specific condition. They prescribe a specific treatment. But Hippocrates is saying, wait, you can't understand this person's illness without understanding their whole life. What do they eat? How do they sleep? What's their occupation? What's their emotional state? Where do they live? What's the climate like? What season is it? The slide says treatment considered the patient's entire lifestyle, occupation, and social circumstances, not merely symptoms. This is what we'd call today a biopsychosocial model of health. Biology, psychology, social context, all interacting. But here's what makes this philosophical, not just medical. Hippocrates is making a claim about the nature of human beings. He's saying, you can't separate the person into discrete parts. You can't treat the body without considering the mind. You can't understand the individual without understanding their environment. This is holism. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. Now, this might not sound revolutionary to you. We talk about holistic medicine all the time now. But think about what this means in the ancient world. Most ancient medicine, the temple medicine, the magical medicine, actually was pretty holistic in its own way. It treated the whole person because it saw illness as a spiritual problem affecting everything. But Hippocrates is doing something different. He's maintaining the holistic approach while grounding it in natural causes. He's saying, yes, we need to consider the whole person, but not because of supernatural forces. Because the body, mind, and environment are naturally interconnected through observable physical processes. And here's where this gets really interesting for us today. Modern medicine went through this whole arc. Ancient medicine, holistic but supernatural. Hippocratic medicine, holistic and natural. Modern scientific medicine, especially 19th, 20th century, reductionist and natural contemporary medicine, trying to get back to holistic and natural. So we spent about 150 years getting really good at treating specific diseases in specific organs while kind of forgetting that the person is a whole system. And now we're rediscovering what Hippocrates knew 2,500 years ago. You can't separate the parts from the whole. But here's the tension. And this is a real philosophical problem we're still wrestling with. How do you maintain scientific rigor while also treating the whole person? Scientific medicine works by isolating variables. You want to know if drug X works? You control for everything else. You make it as unholistic as possible. But real people don't exist in controlled conditions. Real people have stress, and relationships, and jobs, and histories, and environments. So how do you do both? How do you have rigorous, evidence-based medicine that also treats the whole person in their full context? Hippocrates' answer, and I think this is still valid, his careful systematic observation of real patients in their real lives. The slide mentions this is an early form of holistic care and medical anthropology, millennia before modern practice. Medical anthropology. That's the study of how culture, environment, and social factors affect health. It's a whole academic field now. But Hippocrates is already doing it. He's observing how different populations in different environments have different disease patterns. He's noticing how occupation affects health. He's tracking how seasons influence illness. And he's writing it all down. The Hippocratic corpus, we'll talk more about this later, contains detailed case studies. Not just patient had fever, patient died, but patient X, a 40-year-old merchant living in this city at this time of year with these symptoms who we treated with these methods, and here's what happened day by day. This is systematic clinical observation. This is the foundation of evidence-based medicine. And here's what's beautiful about the Hippocratic approach. It holds together the general and the particular. Yes, there are general principles, the theory of humors, the idea of balance, but each patient is unique. Each case is different. The doctor has to know the theory, but then apply it with wisdom to this specific person in this specific situation. This is what Aristotle would later call phronesis, practical wisdom. It's not just theoretical knowledge, episteme, and it's not just technical skill, techne. It's the ability to apply general principles wisely to particular cases. And this is going to become crucial when we talk about medical ethics, because ethics isn't just about following rules. It's about wise judgment in complex situations, which is a lot harder than just memorizing the 4 humors and prescribing accordingly. It requires actually knowing your patient, actually understanding their life, actually thinking carefully about what will help this particular person. And here's something we've lost in modern medicine. This takes time. Hippocratic physicians would observe patients over days, weeks, even months. They'd track the progression of disease carefully. They'd adjust treatments based on response. Modern doctors often have 15 minutes per patient. How do you practice holistic medicine in 15 minutes? But the ideal, the Hippocratic ideal, remains, and I think it's worth fighting for. The idea that medicine is about treating persons, not just diseases. That you have to understand the context, not just the symptoms. That healing requires wisdom, not just technical knowledge. Now all of this, the holistic view, the emphasis on wisdom and judgment, the relationship between doctor and patient, this all connects to what might be Hippocrates' most enduring contribution. Not his medical theory, not his treatments, but his ethics. Because Hippocrates understood something profound. Medicine isn't just a technical skill, it's a moral practice. When you have power over someone's health, over their life and death, you need more than knowledge. You need ethical principles. You need an oath. All right, we've arrived at what is arguably Hippocrates' most lasting contribution to human civilization. Not a medical technique, not a scientific theory, but a moral framework, the Hippocratic Oath. And I want you to really sit with this for a moment. Because what we're looking at here is the first comprehensive code of medical ethics in human history. The first systematic attempt to answer the question, what moral obligations does a healer have? I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view to injury and wrongdoing. Listen to what's packed into that one sentence. According to my ability and judgment, this acknowledges human limitation. The physician isn't claiming divine power. They're promising to do their best with the knowledge and skill they have, but never with a view to injury and wrongdoing. This is the core. This is what we now call the principle of non-maleficence. Do no harm. But here's what I want you to understand. This isn't obvious. This isn't automatic. This needed to be said and sworn to, because the alternative was real. Think about it. A physician has incredible power. They have knowledge that others don't have. They have access to poisons as well as medicines. They see people at their most vulnerable, sick, naked, afraid, desperate. Without ethical constraints, a physician could exploit patients financially, abuse them sexually, experiment on them without consent, use their knowledge to harm rather than heal, reveal private information, abandon patients when treatment becomes difficult. All of these things have happened throughout history when medical ethics weren't enforced. So when Hippocrates creates this oath, he's doing something profound. He's saying, medicine is not just a technical skill, it's a moral practice. It requires ethical commitment. And as the slide says, this established the first comprehensive code of medical ethics, profoundly influencing healthcare practice to this day. To this day. Medical students still take some version of this oath. 2,500 years later. Think about that. The slide identifies 3 core principles. Let's look at each one. First, non-maleficence. Do no harm. This seems simple, but it's philosophically complex. Because here's the thing. Almost all medical treatment involves some harm. Surgery? You're cutting into someone's body. That's harm. Chemotherapy? Poison that hopefully kills the cancer before it kills the patient. Even a simple injection causes pain. So do no harm can't mean never cause any harm. It has to mean something more subtle. Don't cause harm unnecessarily. Don't cause harm for your own benefit. Make sure the potential benefit outweighs the harm. This requires judgment. Wisdom. Exactly what we were talking about with the holistic approach. Second, patient confidentiality. The original oath says, "What I may see or hear in the course of treatment, which should not be spread abroad, I will keep to myself, holding such things shameful to be spoken about." Why is this so important? Because for medicine to work, patients have to tell the truth. They have to reveal embarrassing things, private things, shameful things. If they can't trust the physician to keep their secrets, they won't be honest. And if they're not honest, they can't be properly treated. So confidentiality isn't just about being nice, it's epistemologically necessary for medical knowledge. The physician needs accurate information, and confidentiality is what makes that possible. And this connects to the third principle the slide mentions, exemplary professional conduct in all medical practice. The oath creates what we'd call a fiduciary relationship, a relationship of trust where one party has power and the other is vulnerable. The slide says this linked medicine to a community of trust, establishing responsibility between physician, patient, and society. Notice, not just physician and patient. Physician, patient, and society. Because society has to trust physicians too. Society grants physicians special privileges, the right to cut into bodies, to prescribe powerful drugs, to make life and death decisions. Why does society grant these privileges? Because physicians have sworn an oath. Because they've committed to using their power only for healing, never for harm. This is a social contract. Society says, we'll give you status, authority, and the right to practice medicine. And physicians say, we'll use that power only for the good of patients and society. And when that contract breaks down, when physicians abuse their power, when they prioritize profit over patients, when they violate confidentiality, society loses trust in the entire profession. We're seeing some of that now, aren't we? Debates about pharmaceutical companies, healthcare costs, medical errors. The trust is strained, which is why the Hippocratic Oath still matters. It's a reminder of what medicine is supposed to be. A moral practice, not just a business. A calling, not just a career. But, and this is important, the oath isn't perfect. It's ancient. It reflects ancient values and ancient assumptions. And that's exactly what we need to look at next. Because the oath's legacy is complex. It's inspired medicine for millennia, but it's also controversial in some ways. We need to look at both the power and the problems. Okay, so we've talked about why the Hippocratic Oath is profound and important. Now let's be honest about its problems. Because if we're going to think philosophically about this, we can't just celebrate it uncritically. We have to examine it, question it, understand its limitations. The slide identifies 3 aspects of the oath's complex legacy. Let's work through each one. The original oath contains invocations to Greek gods including Apollo and Asclepius, reflecting its ancient pagan origins and cultural context. The oath begins, "I swear by Apollo the physician, and Asclepius, and Hygieia, and Panacea, and all the gods and goddesses," which is slightly awkward if you're a modern medical student who doesn't worship Greek gods, or if you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, basically anyone who's not an ancient Greek pagan. But here's what's interesting philosophically. Why invoke the gods at all? Remember, we said Hippocrates separated medicine from religion. He said disease has natural causes, not divine ones. So why start the oath with a religious invocation? I think there are 2 things going on here. First, Hippocrates is still a product of his culture. He's revolutionary, but he's not completely outside the worldview of his time. The gods are still part of the conceptual framework. But second, and this is more interesting, invoking the gods makes the oath more serious, more binding. In the ancient world, an oath wasn't just a promise, it was a sacred act. You were calling the gods as witnesses. Breaking an oath was inviting divine punishment. So by making this a religious oath, Hippocrates is saying, this isn't optional. This isn't just professional courtesy. This is sacred duty. Now, we don't need to believe in Apollo to get the point. The point is, medical ethics has to be taken with ultimate seriousness. But the religious elements aren't the only controversial part of the oath. The slide mentions certain provisions regarding euthanasia and abortion remain deeply controversial when evaluated through contemporary ethical frameworks and medical practice. The original oath says, I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I advise such a plan. And similarly, I will not give a woman a pessary to cause an abortion. So, no euthanasia. No abortion, under any circumstances. And here's where we run into serious problems with applying an ancient oath to modern medicine. Because these aren't simple issues. These are some of the most difficult ethical questions we face. Take euthanasia, or as we often call it now, physician-assisted death or medical aid in dying. The Hippocratic position is clear. Never. The physician must never intentionally cause death. But what about a patient with terminal cancer in unbearable pain who rationally chooses to end their life with dignity rather than suffer for weeks or months? What about autonomy? The patient's right to make decisions about their own life and death. What about mercy? Isn't it cruel to force someone to suffer when they're dying anyway? On the other hand, what about the slippery slope? If we allow physician-assisted death in clear cases, where do we draw the line? What about vulnerable populations? Elderly people who might feel pressured to not be a burden. What about the physician's role? Should healers ever be in the business of causing death? I'm not going to tell you what to think about this. This is one of those questions where reasonable, thoughtful people disagree. But what I want you to see is that the simple Hippocratic prohibition, never give a lethal drug, doesn't easily map onto the complexity of modern end-of-life care. The same complexity applies to abortion. The Hippocratic Oath says no, never. But modern medical ethics has to grapple with cases where the mother's life is at risk. Severe fetal abnormalities incompatible with life, pregnancies resulting from rape or incest. The question of when personhood begins, women's autonomy over their own bodies, the role of the physician in reproductive health care. Here's the deeper philosophical issue. Can we have absolute moral rules that apply in every situation? Or does ethics require contextual judgment? The Hippocratic Oath seems to favor absolute rules. Never cause death. Never perform abortion. But the Hippocratic approach to medicine, remember the holistic view, emphasizes context, individual circumstances, practical wisdom. So there's actually a tension within Hippocratic philosophy itself, between the absolutism of the oath and the contextualism of the medical practice. Now, here's what's important, and this is what the slide gets at with the third point. Despite its age and contentious elements, the oath continues to symbolize the enduring ideal of medical professionalism, integrity, and ethical commitment. We don't have to agree with every specific provision of the oath to recognize what it represents. It represents the idea that medicine is a moral practice, that physicians have special obligations, that power must be constrained by ethics, that trust is essential, that the patient's good comes first. And that's why modern medical schools don't usually use the original Hippocratic Oath. They use updated versions that preserve the spirit while adapting to contemporary values. Modern versions typically remove the pagan gods, add commitments to social justice and healthcare access, acknowledge patient autonomy, address modern issues like genetic engineering and organ transplantation, sometimes allow for physician-assisted death in specific circumstances. So it's kind of like how we still value the U.S. Constitution while acknowledging that maybe some of the original provisions needed updating. All men are created equal is a great principle, except enslaved people and women. Yeah, we fixed that part. But the core principle remains. Medicine requires ethical commitment. The physician's power must be used only for the patient's benefit, never for harm. And here's why this still matters, maybe more than ever. Modern medicine has powers that Hippocrates couldn't have imagined. We can keep people alive who would have died, create life in test tubes, edit genes, transplant organs, read minds with brain scans, enhance human capabilities beyond normal. With that kind of power, we need ethical frameworks more than ever. We need physicians who understand that their role is moral, not just technical, and that's what the Hippocratic Oath, in its modern forms, still provides. A reminder that medicine is about more than science and technique. It's about trust. It's about responsibility. It's about using power wisely and ethically. The slide says the Oath bridges ancient wisdom and modern medicine, embodying timeless principles of healing, trust, and ethical responsibility. What makes a principle timeless? Not that it never changes, we've seen it does change, but that it addresses something fundamental about the human condition. And what's fundamental here is this. When we're sick, we're vulnerable. We need help from people with specialized knowledge and power, and we need to be able to trust them. That's true in ancient Greece. It's true now. It'll be true in the future. So the specific rules might change. The oath might be updated, but the question remains, how do we ensure that those with power to heal use that power ethically? The Hippocratic Oath is humanity's first systematic attempt to answer that question. And 2,500 years later, we're still working on it. Now, we've looked at Hippocratic philosophy, the theory, the practice, the ethics. But what's the actual impact? How did these ideas change the world? That's what we need to explore next. Because the Hippocratic legacy isn't just about ancient Greece. It's about the entire development of Western medicine and medical ethics. Let's see how deep this influence really goes. Alright, so we've spent all this time exploring Hippocratic philosophy, the theory, the practice, the ethics. Now I want you to step back and see the bigger picture. What did all of this actually do? How did it change the world? Because here's the thing, Hippocrates didn't just write some interesting treatises that got filed away in a library. He fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization. And I'm not exaggerating. Look at what's on this slide. 4 major impacts, each one massive in its own right. Number 1. Established medicine as a distinct scientific discipline separate from philosophy and theology. Let's unpack what this means. Before Hippocrates, medicine wasn't really a separate field. It was mixed up with religion, with magic, with general philosophy about the nature of things. But Hippocrates says, medicine is its own domain. It has its own subject matter, the human body in health and disease. It has its own methods, observation, diagnosis, treatment. It has its own body of knowledge that accumulates over time. This is huge, because once you establish medicine as a distinct discipline, you create specialized training programs, professional standards, a community of practitioners who share knowledge, a tradition that can be passed down and built upon, institutional structures, medical schools, hospitals, professional organizations. None of this exists before Hippocrates. He's creating the very idea of medicine as a profession. And once you have medicine as a distinct discipline, you can start to develop specializations within it. Number 2, influence the development of specialities including surgery, neurology, and acute medicine. Now, Hippocrates himself wasn't a specialist in the modern sense. He was a general physician. But the Hippocratic corpus, that collection of medical writings we'll talk about more in a moment, contains treatises on specific topics. There's on fractures and on joints, early orthopedics, on head wounds, early neurosurgery, on the sacred disease. That's epilepsy, and it's a fascinating text because Hippocrates argues it's not sacred, it's a natural brain disorder. Do you see what's happening? By treating medicine as a systematic field of knowledge, you can start to organize that knowledge into subfields. You can say, these conditions affect the brain, these affect the bones, these are acute emergencies, these are chronic conditions. This is the beginning of medical specialization. And yes, it'll take centuries to fully develop, but the conceptual foundation is being laid right here. Of course, we've maybe taken specialization a bit far now. You can't just see a doctor anymore. You need a gastroenterologist, a cardiologist, an endocrinologist, an ophthalmologist. Sometimes you need a specialist in left knees as opposed to right knees. But the point is, the idea that medicine can be systematically divided into areas of expertise, that starts with the Hippocratic approach. Now, we've already talked extensively about the ethics, but look at the third impact. Number 3. Inspired centuries of medical practice standards and ethical frameworks worldwide. Worldwide. Centuries. Think about that. The Hippocratic Oath spreads throughout the Greek world, then the Roman Empire, then medieval Europe, then the Islamic world, where it's preserved and enhanced during the European Dark Ages, by the way. Islamic physicians like Avicenna and Zeus built on Hippocratic principles, developed them further, and then transmitted them back to Europe during the Renaissance. So this isn't just a Western story. This is a human story. Different cultures, different religions, different time periods, all finding value in the Hippocratic ethical framework. Why? Because it addresses something universal, the moral relationship between healer and patient. Every culture has healers. Every culture has sick people who need help. And every culture has to grapple with the question, how do we ensure healers use their power ethically? The Hippocratic answer, do no harm, maintain confidentiality, put the patient first, resonates across cultural boundaries. And finally, maybe most importantly for the actual practice of medicine, number 4. Created foundational approaches to clinical observation and patient care still used today. Still used today. When you go to the doctor and they take a detailed history, observe your symptoms carefully, consider your lifestyle and environment, make a diagnosis based on evidence, prescribe treatment and monitor the results, adjust the treatment if needed. That's the Hippocratic clinical method. That's 2,500 years old. What Hippocrates established was a systematic approach to clinical practice. Step 1. Careful observation. Don't just glance at the patient. Really look. Notice everything. Step 2. Detailed recording. Write it down. Track the progression of disease over time. Step 3. Pattern recognition. Compare this case to others you've seen. What's similar? What's different? Step 4. Prognosis. Based on your observations and experience, what's likely to happen? Step 5. Treatment. Intervene based on your understanding of the disease in the patient. Step 6. Follow-up. Did the treatment work? What can you learn from this case? This is still how medicine works. We have better tools now. Lab tests, imaging, genetic analysis. But the fundamental approach is the same. Observe carefully, think systematically, learn from experience, treat the individual patient. The difference is that Hippocrates was doing all this with basically no technology, no x-rays, no blood tests, no MRIs, just his eyes, his hands, his mind, and his experience, which makes what he accomplished even more remarkable. And notice how all 4 of these impacts connect. You establish medicine as a distinct scientific discipline, 1, which allows for specialization, 2, which requires ethical standards to prevent abuse, 3, all built on a foundation of systematic clinical observation, 4, it's a complete system, a comprehensive philosophy of medicine. But here's what I want to show you next. This wasn't just Hippocrates working alone. This was a collective effort, a community of physicians and thinkers. And that community produced something extraordinary. Okay, so we've been talking about Hippocrates said this and Hippocrates did that. But here's the truth. We don't actually know which text Hippocrates himself wrote. What we have is the Hippocratic corpus, as the slide says, a collection of approximately 60 treatises attributed to Hippocrates and his followers, representing collective medical wisdom. So it's kind of like the Bible, or Homer's epics, or Shakespeare's plays. There are all these scholarly debates about who actually wrote what. Did Hippocrates write on airs, waters, and places? Probably. Did he write all 60 texts? Definitely not. Some were written centuries after his death. But here's what's philosophically interesting about this. Maybe the collective authorship is actually the point. The slide says this represents collaborative knowledge. Not one genius working alone, but a community of physicians sharing observations, debating theories, building on each other's work. This is actually how science works. It's not lone geniuses having eureka moments. It's communities of researchers, sharing data, challenging each other's conclusions, replicating studies, building incrementally on previous work. The Hippocratic corpus is one of the first examples of this collaborative scientific approach. So what's actually in this collection? Let me give you a sense of the range. The Oath, which we've discussed, aphorisms, short, memorable medical principles, epidemics, detailed case studies of actual patients. On the sacred disease, arguing epilepsy is natural, not divine. On airs, waters, and places, environmental medicine. On ancient medicine, philosophy of medicine itself. The art, defending medicine as a legitimate profession, surgical texts on fractures, wounds, joints, gynecological texts, dietary texts. This is an attempt to cover the entire field of medicine as they understood it. Theory and practice, general principles and specific cases, philosophy and technique. And the slide emphasizes what makes this special. It emphasized empirical observation, detailed case studies, and systematic documentation of diseases and treatments. Let's focus on that word empirical again, because this is crucial. Empirical means based on observation and experience, not just theory or authority. In many ancient traditions, medical knowledge came from divine revelation, ancient authority, what the old masters said, philosophical deduction, reasoning from first principles. But the Hippocratic approach says, look at actual patients, record what you observe, see what treatments actually work. The epidemics books are particularly fascinating. They contain detailed case histories like this. In Thasos, a woman who lay sick on the plain. On the first day, acute fever, shivering. On the third day, pain in the head and neck. On the fifth day, deafness, acute fever. On the seventh day, died. Notice what's being recorded. Specific patient, woman in Thasos, day-by-day progression, specific symptoms, outcome. This is clinical data, this is evidence. And by collecting many such cases, physicians could start to recognize patterns. Okay, when we see this constellation of symptoms, the disease usually progresses this way, and the outcome is typically this. That's the beginning of evidence-based medicine. Learning from experience, building a database of cases, using past observations to guide future treatment. And the slide mentions systematic documentation of diseases and treatments. Systematic. They're not just randomly jotting down notes. They're trying to create an organized body of knowledge. They're categorizing diseases, classifying symptoms, standardizing terminology. Which brings us to the third point on the slide. And this is the big one. Establish the foundation for Western biomedical methodology, influencing medical education for over 2 millennia. Over 2 millennia. Think about what that means. From roughly 400 BC to roughly 1600 AD, 2,000 years, the Hippocratic corpus was the foundational text for Western medicine. Greek physicians studied it. Roman physicians studied it. Medieval European physicians studied it. Islamic physicians studied it and wrote commentaries on it. Renaissance physicians studied it. That's a longer run than any medical textbook today will have. Your current medical textbooks will be outdated in 10 years, maybe 5. The Hippocratic corpus was current for 2,000 years. Now we have to be honest. This also meant that Western medicine was stuck with some wrong ideas for a very long time. The four humors theory? Wrong, but it dominated medicine until the 1800s. The idea that diseases come from miasmas, bad air? Wrong, but it persisted until germ theory. Many of the treatments, ineffective or even harmful. But here's what's important. Even though many of the specific theories were wrong, the method was right. Observe carefully, record systematically, look for patterns, test treatments, learn from experience, build knowledge over time. That method, that Hippocratic method, is what eventually led to modern scientific medicine. When medicine finally did advance beyond Hippocrates in the 1600s and 1700s with the scientific revolution, it wasn't by abandoning the Hippocratic method. It was by applying that method with better tools. Microscopes let us observe things Hippocrates couldn't see. Controlled experiments let us test treatments more rigorously. Statistical analysis let us find patterns in larger datasets. Germ theory gave us a better explanatory framework than the humors. But the foundation, careful observation, systematic documentation, empirical testing, that's still Hippocratic. When your doctor today orders a blood test, examines you carefully, asks about your medical history, considers your symptoms, makes a diagnosis, and prescribes treatment, they're practicing Hippocratic medicine. With 2,500 years of additional knowledge, yes. With modern technology, yes. But the fundamental approach? That's Hippocrates. And this gets at something profound about the nature of knowledge and tradition. We often think of scientific progress as revolutionary, throwing out the old and replacing it with the new. And sometimes that happens. Germ theory really did overthrow humor theory. But more often, progress is evolutionary. We build on foundations laid by previous generations. We refine methods that were fundamentally sound even if the specific theories were wrong, and that means we owe something to Hippocrates and his followers. Not uncritical acceptance of everything they said, we've moved beyond that, but recognition that they established the path we're still walking. They said medicine should be based on observation, not superstition. They said knowledge should be shared and built upon collectively. They said physicians have ethical obligations to their patients. They said the human body can be understood through systematic study. All of that is still true. All of that still guides medicine today. So we've seen the historical impact, how Hippocratic philosophy shaped medicine for millennia. But what about now? What about the 21st century? Because here's the thing. We're not just studying Hippocrates as ancient history. We're still grappling with Hippocratic questions, still trying to balance the art and science of medicine, still wrestling with medical ethics in new contexts, still figuring out how to treat the whole person, not just the disease. That's what we need to look at next. How does Hippocratic philosophy speak to contemporary medicine? Where do we still need his wisdom? And where do we need to move beyond through 2,500 years of history? We've seen how Hippocratic philosophy revolutionized medicine, shaped Western medical practice, and created the ethical framework for healthcare. But now I want to ask, what does all of this mean for us? Right now. Today. In the 21st century. Because here's what I want you to understand. This isn't just a history lesson. These are live questions, active debates, real dilemmas that doctors, patients, and societies are grappling with right now. Let's look at what the slide tells us. First, do no harm remains the fundamental principle of medical ethics across all healthcare systems worldwide, guiding countless daily decisions. Countless daily decisions. Right now, as we're sitting here, doctors around the world are making decisions. Should we do this surgery? The potential benefit is significant, but so are the risks. Should we prescribe this medication? It might help, but the side effects could be severe. Should we continue aggressive treatment? Or would that cause more suffering than it prevents? And in every single one of these decisions, do no harm is the guiding principle. But here's what's philosophically interesting. Do no harm doesn't give you the answer. It gives you the framework for thinking about the question, because almost everything in medicine involves some harm. Surgery causes pain and trauma. Medications have side effects. Diagnostic tests can be uncomfortable or risky. Even just telling someone they have a serious disease causes psychological harm. So, do no harm really means minimize harm. Make sure the potential benefit outweighs the harm. Don't cause harm unnecessarily or for your own benefit. And that requires judgment, wisdom. Exactly what Hippocrates emphasized with his holistic approach. But here's where it gets really challenging in the modern world. The slide says, modern medicine faces the complex challenge of balancing rapid innovation and technological advancement with patient safety and traditional ethical values. Think about what modern medicine can do that Hippocrates never dreamed of. We can edit genes with CRISPR technology. We can keep people alive indefinitely on machines. We can transplant organs from one person to another. We can create embryos in laboratories. We can use AI to make diagnostic decisions. We can enhance human capabilities beyond normal functioning. Every single one of these capabilities raises profound ethical questions. Take gene editing. We can now modify human DNA. We can potentially eliminate genetic diseases before a child is even born. Is that doing no harm? You're preventing terrible suffering? Or is it doing harm? You're fundamentally altering human nature, playing God, potentially creating unforeseen consequences. Hippocrates can't tell us the answer to that question. He didn't know about genes, but the framework he gave us, the ethical framework, that's what we use to think about it. And here's the thing, technology is advancing faster than our ethical frameworks can keep up. By the time we've had a thorough ethical debate about one technology, 3 new ones have emerged. CRISPR was discovered in 2012. By 2018, a Chinese scientist had used it to edit human embryos. The ethical debate is still ongoing. but the technology is already here. So the slide mentions balancing rapid innovation with patient safety and traditional ethical values. On one side, innovation saves lives. New treatments, new technologies, new approaches, they give hope to people who would otherwise suffer or die. Patients with terminal diseases don't want to wait 20 years for careful ethical deliberation. They want the experimental treatment now. On the other side, moving too fast can cause harm. Thalidomide, lobotomies, experimental surgeries that went horribly wrong. History is full of medical innovations that seemed promising but turned out to be disasters. So here's the Hippocratic question we're still asking. How do we innovate responsibly? How do we push the boundaries of what's possible while still protecting patients? And notice, this is exactly the tension Hippocrates himself navigated. He was an innovator. He was pushing beyond traditional medicine. But he was also deeply concerned with patient safety and ethical practice. Which brings us to the third point on the slide. And this is where it gets really interesting. Hippocratic ideals continue to inspire vital discussions about end-of-life care, genetic engineering, and patient autonomy in contemporary bioethics. Let's look at each of these. End-of-life care. We've already touched on this with physician-assisted death, but it's broader than that. When do we stop aggressive treatment and switch to palliative care? Who decides? The doctor, the patient, the family? What about patients who can't communicate their wishes? What about the costs, both financial and emotional, of prolonging life? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. These are decisions that families are making every day in hospitals around the world. Your grandmother is on a ventilator. She's 95, has advanced dementia, and the doctors say she'll never recover consciousness. Do you keep her on life support? Do no harm. What does that mean here? Is harm keeping her alive in a state she wouldn't have wanted? Or is harm letting her die? The Hippocratic Oath says, never give a lethal drug. But it doesn't tell you what to do when the technology exists to keep someone alive indefinitely in a state that might not be living. This is what I mean when I say we're still grappling with Hippocratic questions. The specific scenario is new. Ventilators didn't exist in ancient Greece, but the ethical framework is still Hippocratic. Genetic engineering. We've mentioned CRISPR, but think about the broader implications. Should we edit embryos to eliminate disease genes? Probably yes, most people would say. Should we edit embryos to enhance traits, make people smarter, stronger, more attractive? Now it gets controversial, and here's where it connects to Hippocratic philosophy. What is medicine for? Hippocrates said medicine is for treating disease, for restoring health, for helping people flourish within their natural capacities. But if we can enhance beyond natural capacities, if we can make people superhuman, is that still medicine? Or is it something else? And if it's something else, do the same ethical principles apply? Is do no harm still the guiding principle? Or do we need a new framework? Third debate. Patient autonomy. This is huge in contemporary bioethics. In Hippocratic medicine, and really up until the mid-20th century, the doctor decided what was best for the patient. Paternalistic medicine. The doctor knows best. The patient should trust and obey. But modern medical ethics emphasizes patient autonomy. The patient has the right to make their own decisions about their health care, even if the doctor disagrees. So if a patient refuses a treatment that would save their life, maybe for religious reasons, maybe they just don't want it, should the doctor respect that choice? Do no harm would seem to say, give the life-saving treatment. But respecting autonomy says, the patient has the right to refuse. This is a profound philosophical question about the nature of harm. Is it harm to let someone die when you could save them? Or is it harm to force treatment on someone against their will? Is respecting someone's autonomous choice part of doing no harm? Or does harm refer only to physical harm? Hippocrates lived in a culture where individual autonomy wasn't valued the way we value it now, so his framework doesn't directly address this question. But here's what's remarkable. The Hippocratic framework is flexible enough to incorporate new values. We can say, do no harm, includes respecting patient autonomy, because forcing treatment on someone against their will causes psychological and moral harm. We can expand the Hippocratic principle to include modern values while maintaining its core insight. And that's what makes Hippocratic philosophy a living tradition rather than a dead historical artifact. It's not that we just repeat what Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago. It's that we use his framework to think through new problems. We ask, what would the Hippocratic principles, properly understood and adapted, say about this contemporary issue? And that brings us to something really important. How do we actually apply ancient wisdom to modern practice? What does Hippocratic philosophy look like in a 21st century hospital? All right, we've covered a lot of ground. We've traveled from ancient Greece to the cutting edge of modern medicine. We've explored theories, practices, ethics, and legacy. Now let's bring it all together. Let's see the complete picture of what Hippocratic philosophy means. The slide gives us 3 key points, and I want to work through each one carefully because this is where everything we've discussed comes into focus. Revolutionary transformation transformed medicine from superstition and mythology into a scientific discipline grounded in ethics and empirical observation. Think about the magnitude of that transformation. Before Hippocrates, disease is divine punishment. Healing requires appeasing gods. Knowledge comes from revelation. The sick are morally suspect. After Hippocrates, disease has natural causes. Healing requires understanding nature. Knowledge comes from observation. The sick deserve compassionate care. This isn't just a change in medical practice. This is a fundamental shift in how human beings understand reality. It's a shift from a supernatural worldview to a naturalistic one. From faith-based knowledge to empirical knowledge. From passive acceptance to active investigation. From divine authority to human reason. This is one of the great intellectual revolutions in human history, and it happens in medicine before it happens in most other fields. Why medicine? Why does this revolution happen here first? Because medicine is urgent. Because people are suffering and dying. Because you can't afford to wait for divine intervention when someone's bleeding out in front of you. Medicine forces you to confront reality. Either your treatments work or they don't. Either patients get better or they don't. You get immediate feedback. So medicine becomes the testing ground for a new way of knowing, and once that method proves successful in medicine, it spreads to other domains. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, Galileo, Newton, the whole transformation of physics and astronomy, that's applying the Hippocratic method to the cosmos. Observe carefully. Look for natural causes. Test your theories against evidence. Build systematic knowledge. But notice, and this is crucial, the slide doesn't just say Hippocrates made medicine scientific. It says he grounded it in ethics and empirical observation. Ethics and empiricism, not one or the other, both. Because Hippocrates understood something profound. Scientific knowledge without ethical constraints is dangerous. If you know how to heal, you also know how to harm. If you understand the body, you can exploit that knowledge. If you have power over the vulnerable, you need moral principles to guide that power. So the Hippocratic revolution isn't just about making medicine scientific. It's about making medicine scientific and ethical. Knowledge and wisdom. Power and responsibility. Technique and compassion. That's the revolutionary transformation, and it's still revolutionary today. Now, second point, enduring principles. Holistic, ethical, and empirical principles continue to guide healthcare professionals across cultures and medical systems worldwide. What makes a principle endure? What makes it last not just decades or centuries, but millennia? It has to address something fundamental about the human condition. Something that doesn't change even as technology and culture change, and that's exactly what Hippocratic principles do. Holistic. Treat the whole person, not just the disease. Body, mind, environment, all connected. This endures because human beings are whole integrated systems. You can't actually separate the parts, no matter how much reductionist science tries. Your mental state affects your physical health. Your environment affects your well-being. Your social relationships impact your recovery. Hippocrates knew this 2,500 years ago. We forgot it for a while. Now we're remembering. Ethical. Medicine is a moral practice. Healers have special obligations. Power must be constrained by ethics. This endures because the power imbalance between doctor and patient is constant. As long as some people have medical knowledge and others don't, as long as some people are sick and vulnerable and others are healthy and powerful, as long as healing requires trust, we need ethical principles to govern that relationship. And notice the slide says across cultures and medical systems worldwide. This isn't just Western medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine has its own ethical principles. Ayurvedic medicine in India has ethical frameworks. Indigenous healing traditions have codes of conduct. The specific principles might vary, but the recognition that healing is a moral practice, that's universal. Hippocrates articulated it first in the Western tradition, but the insight itself transcends any particular culture. Empirical. Base your beliefs on observation and evidence, not on authority or tradition. This endures because it works. It produces knowledge that's reliable, that builds over time, that leads to better outcomes. And here's what's beautiful about the empirical approach. It's self-correcting. When you base beliefs on evidence and new evidence comes in that contradicts your beliefs, you change your beliefs. That's why medicine has progressed from Hippocrates' time. Not because we abandoned his method, but because we applied it rigorously. We observed more carefully. We tested more systematically. We accumulated more evidence. And we changed our theories when the evidence demanded it. So these principles endure not because they're frozen in time, but because they're alive. They're dynamic. They're constantly being applied to new situations. That's what makes this a living philosophical tradition rather than a dead historical artifact. Which brings us to the final point on this slide. And this is where it gets poetic. Eternal beacon. His vision endures as a beacon for compassionate, wise medical practice, illuminating the path for future generations of healers. A beacon, a light, illuminating the path. Think about what a beacon does. It doesn't tell you exactly where to go. It doesn't make your decisions for you, but it shows you the direction. It helps you navigate. It keeps you oriented when things get confusing or dark. That's exactly what Hippocratic philosophy does for medicine. When medical practice gets too technical, too impersonal, too focused on disease and not enough on people, the Hippocratic beacon reminds us, treat the whole person. When medicine gets corrupted by commercial interests, when profit starts to matter more than patients, the Hippocratic beacon reminds us, first, do no harm. Put the patient's welfare first. When we're tempted to move too fast, to adopt new technologies without thinking through the ethical implications, the Hippocratic beacon reminds us, use your power wisely. Consider the consequences. When healthcare workers are exhausted, burned out, wondering why they got into this profession, the Hippocratic beacon reminds them, this is noble work. This is about healing suffering. This matters. And the slide says this vision illuminates the path for future generations of healers. Future generations, not just us, not just now. But the doctors, nurses, healers who will practice medicine 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, they'll have technologies we can't imagine. They'll face ethical dilemmas we haven't thought of. They'll treat diseases that don't exist yet or that we can't cure now. But they'll still need the Hippocratic beacon, because they'll still be treating vulnerable human beings. Because they'll still have power that needs ethical constraints. Because they'll still need to balance science and compassion. Because they'll still need wisdom, not just knowledge. That's what makes Hippocratic philosophy timeless. Not that every specific principle stays the same, but that the core questions remain. What is healing? How should we treat the sick? What moral obligations do healers have? How do we use knowledge and power responsibly? As long as there are sick people and healers, these questions will matter. So that's the timeless legacy. Revolutionary transformation, enduring principles, eternal beacon. Thank you.